in your bio about the Shelby County v. Holder Supreme Court case, which I hope many of you know is the 2013 Supreme Court case, which gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But what else actually inspired you to focus on the efforts of Bob Moses and the Mississippi Summer Project?
So I always give credit where it's due, and in this case, it falls at the feet of a brilliant author named Taylor Branch, who wrote a trilogy of books on the civil rights movement. The first one of which won the Pulitzer Prize, called Parting the Waters. And I read that book just on a lark. I mean, I didn't even really know what it was. It was on a bargain book table for a couple of bucks, and I picked it up, and it just, like, my mind exploded, because I, as a white middle-class kid, was never taught any of this, right? I mean, I was taught Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and the March on Washington, and that was kind of it. And then like, racism was over, right? I mean, we moved on. So learning about people like Bob, and learning about people like Bob Moses, I mean, Bob Zellner, who's here and graciously joined us with his wife, Pamela. Hi, Pamela. You know, I was astonished, and Bob Moses stood out from everybody else because he was not your caricature of a civil rights leader. He didn't stand up on a soapbox and yell and scream and follow me, and, you know, he was very, very quiet and very methodical and very cerebral about his approach to things. And so I wanted to know more about him. And I kept pitching his story to my documentary friends, who kept turning me down because they had other projects. And I just kind of put it on the back burner until I went to an event at the Museum of the Moving Image in Astoria, Queens, that was a reunion of the cast of Roots, the miniseries from the 70s. And they had 4 members on stage. They had LeVar Burton and Leslie Uggams and Ben Vereen and Luke Gossett Jr. And this was right the winter of 2013, after Obama's second inauguration. You know, we were all feeling pretty good about the direction the country was going in, and they were not. They were really chastising the audience for this idea of a post-racial society, and they were trying to implore us to understand that if you think that we're beyond racism, that we're delusional, right? And this was a very NPR, PBS-y, interracial crowd, very middle class kind of people who go to these events. And they were like, what are you doing today? What are you doing now to ensure a more socially just and equitable society? And I turned to my friend next to me and said, I'm going to make this movie about Bob Moses. And of course he said, who's Bob Moses? Because he had never heard of him either, right? And that led me down the road to having my first interview with Harry Belafonte, who was a friend of a friend, who then offered to introduce me to Bob Moses, and then never got around to it. And I just ended up picking up the phone, and I called the Algebra Project and said, I have this idea for a project. Bob's assistant pitched it to Bob Moses, who signed on. And literally, as soon as Bob Moses signed on, to be punny, it was like, you know, parting the waters, like Moses parted the waters. And all of a sudden, I really got access to people like Bob Zellner, you know, through the SNCC Legacy Project. And I really went off and running from there. Because last thing, in between that call to the Algebra Project and the meeting with Harry Belafonte was the Shelby County decision, right? So in June of 2013, when they gutted the Voting Rights Act, I had this idea for this movie, but I didn't have any access to anybody. And I really felt like kind of what Kristine felt like, what do I do? Like, how do I make this happen? And I felt like events were running away from me, and that I needed to sort of get on top of this if I was going to make any kind of difference. Mind you, I didn't know the film would take 6.5 years to make. I mean, I really thought this was like a 7-month project. And, you know, my wife, you know, she's like a saint for putting up with me for this long.
But it is coming out at a really great time with all of the screenings. And I love what you said about, like, what do I do now? Because that's kind of what comes out very much. And I have to say, part of the reason why I felt that way was listening to all of the speakers who were part of the Mississippi Summer Project In fact, one, Helen Booth, said, what the world needed at that moment was people not acting without fear, but acting in spite of it. And this leads me to a question for Bob. What drove you to act in the 1960s? You were participating in the voter registration drives. You ended up getting beaten, jailed multiple times, but you still acted. What compelled you to do this?
Well, thank you. The main compelling motivation for doing that was people had already been doing it. And we saw the example of people who felt so strongly about democratic rights and the ending of segregation. And I had seen that since I was an undergraduate in college at Huntington College in Montgomery, Alabama, that they felt so strongly about it that they were willing to give up their life if necessary for this. So it was, and it was also very compelling that it was young people my age who were doing this, like John Lewis from my own state of Alabama, from the same area of Alabama. So that's what compelled me. We were drawn like a moth to a flame, and the young people in SNCC, they were the flame.
How did your family react when you joined?
Well, I was very lucky that my father, having grown up in a Ku Klux Klan family with a father in the Ku Klux Klan, brothers and sisters, that my father had been able to break from the Ku Klux Klan. So from an early age, I saw this struggle within my own family because my mother's side of the family being having strong roots in the indigenous peoples, the Native American South, they were not in favor of the Klan at all. So when my father was able to quit the Ku Klux Klan, my mother cut up his Klan robes and made white shirts for us to go to Sunday school in. So I had been already in this this struggle for the soul of America, and especially the South. I'd been in it since childhood. So when the young people rose up under the leadership of John Lewis and Diane Nash and the four freshmen in Greensboro, North Carolina, my eyes were glued on their actions. And the fact that the Freedom Ride came to Montgomery, Alabama, and they were so badly massacred and beaten again. And I was able to bring some students from my own college down to be an eyewitness to this incredible courage and determination and commitment. And that was the only thing a decent person could do at that time, was to go to that activity and become a part of it if possible.
Just had to unmute myself.
Yeah, if I can interject for 1 second.
Absolutely.
To a person that I interviewed, the two biggest factors for joining the movement, Bob Moses cited the Freedom Rides, right? So he said the Freedom Rides and the sit-ins, he was seeing imagery of Black people where they looked like he felt. Like he was seeing in their eyes exactly what he was feeling inside, and he had to go down. He was compelled like a moth to the flame, like Bob just said. The other one was Emmett Till. And the murder of Emmett Till had such a profound effect, especially on the Black young people in the South. Everyone who was that I interviewed in SNCC and in the NAACP in the early 60s cited Emmett Till as a reason for joining the movement. And when they saw the pictures in Jet magazine, and because that was them, right? That could just as easily have been them. And so that also comes back to your question about fear, because that picture of Emmett Till resonated with them even as they were working. They always had that fear of being alone in a dark place without a way to get out when interacting with authority. So those two things came up. I did over 50 interviews, came up again and again and again. And ironically, no matter what you were doing, and Bob, you can probably attest to this, you were called a freedom writer. That was sort of your label, right? Oh, you're one of those freedom writers, right? Even if you were never on the bus, you were a freedom writer. Like, that was your label. So
that's right. And also the Emmett Till lynching was resonated with me as a young white Southerner, because when I was in high school in Mobile, but in the years 56 and 57, Mac Parker was lynched in Poplarville, Mississippi, which was basically just across the Mississippi line and very close to Mobile. And so those lynchings were very impactful on me, and I'm sure other young people too. But the Emmett Till lynching was terribly frightening to children, because it was an example that racism was such a powerful, evil force that even your parents, even your adult guardians, could not protect you from this evil. So it was very scary for young people to realize that there's something out there that is monstrous and powerful and fearful. So, and that's why Mississippi was such a horrible symbol of fear. And Mississippi intended it to be that way.
Yes. Thinking back kind of in history and thinking about Mississippi, Gavin, you pulled a lot of kind of archival footage of politicians speaking, talking about kind of all of their states' rights and justifications for the segregation, justifications for the literacy tests that Blacks had to go through. If you've never seen a literacy test before, there's one floating about on the web from Louisiana that you can't possibly pass. I give it to my students every year. It's absolutely ridiculous. But Gavin, I want to get to a little bit about, why did you focus on voter registration and voter suppression? Because that's the theme that kind of connects the two ends of your film, between Mississippi and now North Carolina. Obviously, the other connector is Mr. Zellner there, because he's involved in both.
Yeah, so you can't tell the Bob Moses story without telling the Freedom Summer Project story, and you can't tell the Summer Project story without talking about voting rights, right? And so the project ended up pivoting from being about Bob Moses per se or exclusively, really for a couple of reasons. Well, one was there's not a ton of Bob Moses footage out there, right? I mean, there's just not a lot of supporting footage of Bob. There's some, but not enough to fill a movie. And another movie was being made on Freedom Summer already by a very renowned documentarian. And it occurred to me that this wasn't a historical story. I mean, it wasn't a story that takes place in the past, that this story is also now, right? And that in order for people to understand where we are today, it's really helpful to have the historical context of where we came from then. And then connecting those dots is really, I found to be really fascinating about the flipping of the South from Democrat to Republican and the Southern strategy, and then Reagan sort of putting a happy face on it. And then like where we go to today, which is really almost coming full circle, right? I mean, our dog whistles are back to being bullhorns, almost 60 years later. So what I tell people is that this didn't just emerge from a vacuum, right? This is part of the social fabric of our country and always has been. And that if you understand that, then you can actually, get involved in the dialogue about where we are from a place of knowledge. Because if people were willing, like Bob, to put their bodies on the line and risk their lives for this right to vote, the least we can do is register and show up, right? Because it meant enough, A, that they would do that. It meant enough to the other side that they'd be willing to kill you to prevent you from doing it. And so if the stakes are that high, then, and all we're being asked to do is to fill out a form and, once a year go pull a lever. It's my feeling that as, someone who's telling the story, that you should be left with that feeling of responsibility, that you should be left with the idea that at the very least, you should register and vote, because if it didn't mean that much, they wouldn't work so hard to keep you from doing it.
Well, I totally agree about voter registration. And I just want to kind of give a couple little notices to our attendees. The book that Gavin mentioned before, Parting the Waters, the library does have that in its collection. So if you want to check it out, please go to fergusonlibrary.org. And then also voter registration. It is coming up that we are going to be having the presidential election. Absentee ballot applications are going to be mailed out. So if you don't know if you are registered to vote, maybe you haven't voted in a while and need to check. If you go to the League of Women Voters of Stamford, everything is there, every link to what you need. So lwvstanford.org. Mr. Zellner, I actually want to talk to you because Gavin brought up a very interesting idea that what you guys fought for in the 1960s is now coming back, not just with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but with a number of different laws that state legislatures have been trying to put into place, like voter ID in North Carolina. And I noticed that you were involved in the protest against that. Can you talk about your experiences now in the fight in North Carolina versus what you fought in the 1960s? What's the same? What's different? And is it frustrating to still be fighting for voting rights 60 years later?
Yes, it is very frustrating to still be fighting for that. And the film points out one of the things that just leaps out at me is the film points out the relentlessness, the absolute insistence by the racist and the people who are the haters. Their relentless restrictions on the vote, starting after during the first or following the first Reconstruction, to restrict the vote and take the vote back away from people who had won the vote through one of the worst wars that ever took place. And they just were relentless in taking that vote away. And exactly the same thing is happening now. So the point that I would like to make is that every election, people should have feel a responsibility to be registered to vote and to actually go and vote. But this year, it's even more special because we have an election that wants to take us back pre-Civil War. So this is not just a normal, in respect to those people who gave their lives to get the right to vote. This is a special election that involves whether or not we're going to go into a future of togetherness, or are we going to go back to the divisive things that occurred after after the Civil War? So this is an incredibly important time for this film to come out. And having just looked at a lot of the film again, I don't think anybody could sit down and watch this film from beginning to end and not just be on fire to make sure they're registered to vote and vote themselves, and to be shouting it from the rooftops. We have to vote, as Reverend Barber would say, like we have never voted before in this particular election, because if we don't, we may not have any more elections.
Can I just?
Yeah, absolutely, Emma.
All right. I just sitting here listening, and I agree. Not only is voter registration and voter rights and all of that, but I would dare say that democracy is at stake. What it should look like, what we should be as citizens. But to remember, though, that even in the midst of all of this that you see, do not allow anyone or anything, even including this COVID 2019, stop you from exercising your right to vote. So for those, and I just saw a note pop up on the screen here as a reminder that if you have recently moved, if you married, any of those things where there is a change, you should immediately go and make that change so that when November comes, you have no difficulty and your name is there listed, you can cast your vote, because it is that important. This is not anything to be taken lightly. And I think people are ready, because if it was next Tuesday, I'm ready for it already.
We introduce Emma so people know who Emma is.
Oh, me, for folks, and I know there's a bunch of folks looking at me, native of Stamford, very heavily involved in the NAACP. And so as a fighter, a person in the struggle, and I know there are numerous people all over the state, all over the country that are part of organizations such as the NAACP, where we understand to continue to make sure that all citizens have that right to vote, and that the 14th Amendment is still alive and well, for sure.
Speaking of, I actually have a question for you, Emma.
Okay.
So there was a moment in the film where the point was made that it was when, I think I have the actual quote here. This was after they caught the sheriff and the two deputies who were responsible for the death of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. And the quote was, "Still the problem that the country didn't recognize. There is the picture of the three law officers on the front of Life magazine that summer, and they are laughing and joking, and it's all a big joke. As so the country, and so the country can look at that and say, that's not us. And that's the problem, because it really is you folks. This is the country, and unless you understand that this is you in this country and that you are part of what is making this happen, then there is no way we are not going to be able to do anything about it." But there are organizations that are trying to do something about it. The NAACP is one. Can you talk about what the NAACP is doing in Stamford and in Connecticut as a whole in terms of voter registration and voter suppression?
There will be, and registration drives. There will be, I know there's a National Voter Registration Day, which I believe is September 22nd. Yep. And everyone should absolutely register to do that. But I know there's, in June of 2018, not only did the national NAACP, but the Connecticut State Conference of NAACP had made a federal lawsuit to challenge the practice of counting prisoners in the state they're incarcerated in to have them counted in their home state. And that is, and still, if I understand it, it's made it to the next step. So I guess there will be some more to come, but that is a big deal. What it did, the goal was to compel the state to adopt new redistricting maps so that when you count these prisoners, you count them in their whole state. Because what it was doing was making making an imbalance in terms of the rural areas where the prisons are, like Summers, Enfield, making the numbers not true, okay, and thusly giving them an advantage. And so what they wanted to do really safeguard the 14th Amendment, but the principle, one vote, one person, one vote, that's really what that was really all about. And so that's one of the big things that I think, if people aren't aware, that I'm glad to share that this evening.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's coming. And if you're interested in joining myself and others, you can definitely reach out to me. Go to our website, stanfordnaacp.org, and look under membership. Send me a note, and be glad to bring you on board, so you can help do voter registration.
Excellent. I have a question from an attendee for Bob, but before I ask the question, I see there are a number of questions about absentee ballots. I will get to that towards the end of tonight. So I will answer any and all questions you have about the balloting process. So Bob, one of our attendees wanted to ask, are there lessons, strategies, or tactics from the civil rights successes in the 60s that you think we aren't using today to fight voter suppression?
Are there tactics that were used then that we're not using now? Well, I'm not sure, but one of the main tactics we used then that is now being used is intensive saturation education, which the film is a good part of. And it's going to be used all over the country. It's going to be used nationally to educate people to the importance of the vote, the history of the struggle for the vote, and most importantly, the current activities and efforts to restrict the vote. So if in 2020 we're still fighting in this country to make it more difficult for people to vote, that is it's a ridiculous thing for us to have to be still fighting for. And what we're hopefully, maybe one of the things that could be used now is the incredible surge in activity and commitment on the part of white people across the country because of George Floyd and the relentless use of the police for now public lynchings, and to keep the Black population and the radicals in check. So I think that that is one of the things that can be harnessed in this upcoming election, is that the prime thing that all of those people now who are willing to get out on the streets in places like Fairhope, Alabama, where we are right now, and Mobile, Alabama, we need to make sure that they will put up a sign in their yard to go and vote, and that they will see that that is one of the prime things that they can do with this new interest in racial equality, is to go and vote for a change in the administration, so that we can have time to hopefully have a reconstruction now of our country, because we've just been devastated. Our economy has been devastated. Our country has lost its standing in the world. So we have a tremendous reconstruction job to be done. And the first way to do that is to vote in an administration that will allow us to do that recovery work.
What about things like, having marshals, the organization of SNCC, do you see that now? Marshals and watchers and people that have these different jobs, and then also the songs.
Mm-hmm.
The songs.
Yeah, they don't have that now.
Yeah, well, we're in the midst of a tremendous organizing here in Alabama, and we see a need to do several things now that we did then, and we need a lot more training in nonviolent direct action. So we're having new workshops to spread that. Not only the philosophy, but the techniques of nonviolent direct action. And the other thing we're trying, and it's happening all over the country because of this new upsurge of the movement, is to bring back music and singing. And young people are writing freedom songs again about the specific things that they're involved in. So everywhere you are, get the people not only marching, but get them organized for the marches and get singing again. So we're letting the light in, and we're letting the joy back in the movement, and we shall overcome.
I think part of what I think I liked so much about the movie, Gavin, is getting that light. The light can be positive and joyful, but the light can also be the light of truth, and shining a light on what may not be necessarily transparent. And when taking a look at the North Carolina voter ID legislation, you were actually able to get some very important people from North Carolina who were in favor of the voter ID. And for those of you who didn't watch all the way through, North Carolina tried to pass a law and then tried to pass a constitutional amendment to their state constitution to require a photo identification in order to vote. And they're like, oh, well, it's not that difficult to get. Unless you happen to not live anywhere near a DMV, you don't have the money for an ID, you may not have the paperwork necessarily to prove your identification to get the ID. And it was found, the last court case I saw, which was in February of this year, the North Carolina Court of Appeals said the constitutional amendment can't stand. And part of the reason was the impact was going to be so negative to people of color. And yet you got all of these Republicans who are helping to get this passed, and you had some archival footage as well. And they're like, but we're not racist. We're not doing this because of race. It just so happens that it's going to hit these people. First of all, yeah. How did you get them to actually talk to you? And second of all, you bring up the concept of, is a law still racist if the intent was not racist?
Yeah.
So I'd like you to talk about that a little bit.
Okay. It's a really interesting, I found an interesting vein of the film, right? Because when Bob started in the early 60s, there was no ambiguity, right? It was white people keeping black people down at the point of a gun. It was literally black and white. Now, it's very mushy, and it's on purpose that it's that mushy, right? So what they do is they legislate these laws that have what they call disparate impact, which literally are meant to be harmful to people of color, but on their surface have some kind of legal justification, right? So like a voter ID law is meant to be, they don't call it voter suppression, they call it voter integrity, election integrity laws. We are protecting the integrity of the election. How do we know you are who you say you are, right? How can we have a free and fair election if the other side is cheating? Well, we found out that the other side isn't cheating, that no one cheats, right? That it, well, I mean, you know, statistically, no one cheats. We'll put it that way. So if you have a million votes and there's 2 or 10 illegal ones, statistically that's 0, right? So what they're finding is that, and the Court of Appeals has found, that this is a solution in search of a problem, right? There's no real problem there, so why are you enacting the solution? North Carolina was dumb enough, and I'm sorry to use that term, maybe that's the wrong term, careless enough to leave a paper trail of their intent, right, in email form, so that the court could read this and say, well, you did X, Y, and Z, and you did it because you said right here that we were looking to disenfranchise Black people. So, I mean, it became a really easy case for them to decide. The way that but what I did found, to your point, Kristine, is that the people I spoke to would never consider themselves racist. They really, they are true believers in this voter integrity line. They think that voter fraud is a problem. They think that if it's not a problem, it's just because we're not looking hard enough and that we're not finding it, and that it's a wide open door for fraud to walk through. Now, this is, you know, whether they're believing it or not, there are another group of people who cynically prey upon that group of people, right? So you have racists who really just want to suppress people of color. You have people like that who really think that this voter fraud thing is a scourge that needs to be stamped out. And then you have cynics who play one against the other, right? And so it's a pretty difficult thing to get a hold of, because they usually leave themselves an out. So the law says if there is racial intent, the law is unconstitutional. If it has disparate impact, it might be unconstitutional, but we'll give you a chance to fix it, right? And so that law, that constitutional amendment thing that you brought up was really fascinating. They had a ballot referendum to change the Constitution to let North Carolina have a voter ID law, and it passed by a large margin. It wasn't even really all that close. So North Carolina was like, yay, we got our voter ID in. And this judge said, whoa, whoa, whoa. You can't have this constitutional amendment because the legislature that passed this law was formed through gerrymandering maps that were illegal. So that entire General Assembly that wrote the law that you are voting into a constitutional amendment is basically unconstitutional. So it's like a domino effect, right? And North Carolina is sort of the gift that keeps on giving when it comes to this. Like every other month, there's another North Carolina story about, you know, their funny business with voting. But my feeling as to why they talk to me, I think that they really they want to make their case. They really feel like they're on the right side of history. They don't trust me as far as they can throw me. They think I'm some kind of New York liberal guy who's going to make those dumb Southerners look stupid. So they always film me. They film me while I film them, so that they have a record of what I'm saying and what I'm asking them. And, you know, they were very open about their feelings. Now, Governor Pat McCrory had no interest in talking to me. I couldn't get him to say boo to me. But as far as my being able to play the sides off each other in this film, that was my intent, was to not belittle the voting ID people, was to put their story out there and then counter it with Bob Moses, Bob Zellner, Julian Bond, Reverend Barber, and let the people decide, right? Who's got the stronger argument here? What is the issue, and how are we going to skirt around this, right? I don't think everybody is a lying racist. I think a lot of these people are true zealots for whatever cause they're involved in. But North Carolina has a pretty common problem, especially in the South. How do you judge disparate impact versus versus political impact if all the Black people are on one side of the fence, right? If 98% of Black people are Democrats and you are making a political move to screw over Democrats, you are de facto going to be screwing over black people. And so black people are going to cry foul, and you're going to have a really hard time proving that there's not disparate impact, even though your intent was political in nature, if it has a racial byproduct. But of course, the joke is that they keep saying the quiet part out loud as you find out that it is racial in nature, as Julian Bond says in the movie, right? He says, of course it's race. What are you talking about? You know, and you're almost an idiot if you think it's not. And that's the, so you have these arguments and they go back and forth, but Derek Smith says it too. He says, you know, at the foundation of every political discussion in the South is the salient issue of race. Like it's just the underpinning of all of these moves.
There's some real humor in that too, because while we were in this struggle in North Carolina, news reporters would be talking to some of those people that were promulgating these laws, and they would just tell the truth.
Yeah.
And then the reporter would say, "You do understand that people are hearing what you're saying."
Right. You're talking to a camera, right? Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So I have a question from the attendees. Do you think the definition of the word radical has changed over time? Radical in the 1960s included sit-ins and bus rides. If the word has changed, what do you think radical looks now? And I'm going to open that up to everyone.
Folks, I think when you make a move against something that you feel is just simply wrong, it's probably not only a surprise, but it's probably considered radical. And to have the audacity to call it out is another thing, I think. But radical, I don't think it has changed that much in definition, because there's always action with it. At least in my eyes, you see action and you see some change and you see a bump and it might go to the right or the left, but then you get back on course. So I just think that people are generally in this day and time still surprised, because I had a conversation with someone who said that, well, I think, you know, the country's better and race is really still not a problem. So, but it's very much,
right? I mean,
it's still a problem, and it's still going to be people such as myself that are going to call you out on it. But I don't think radical has changed that significantly. I like that people are still bold enough to be radical and to demand change. So
I think you're absolutely right. I think that action is what defines a radical, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and Bob, we'll give you the last word on this, but I mean, you know, in apartheid South Africa, you know, the white people were always like, oh, we need to slow down. The black people aren't ready, right? And when Martin Luther King was thrown in Birmingham jail, his big letter was all about people arguing for moderation. He's like, easy for you to say, right? They're not beating your head in, you know? So and now the Black Lives Matter, you know, we're watching black people die on video weekly at the hands of police. Are you expecting everybody just to say, oh, you know, we'll take it slow, you know, we'll lose a few more this month, but maybe by December, they'll stop killing people. I mean, it's when is the right time? Like, if not now, when, right? If not you, who, right? It's always about a call to action. And I think that's the, it's a label that the right likes to throw at people who want to upend the apple cart and change the status quo, is to call them radical. In Bob's time, they would call you a communist, right? And I remember asking Dick Gregory about that, you know, about being labeled a communist. And he looked at me and goes, that's a white person's word. You know, black people didn't give a crap about communism. Like, what is that? That meant nothing to them. He was like, that was something white people discussed amongst themselves. We had no interest in that conversation at all, you know? And so it's you know, when they start throwing labels at you, you know that you're doing something right. basically, is sort of my take on it.
Yeah. Well, that is a discussion about the meaning of the word radical is a great discussion. And I remember when during the fusion politics work that we were doing in North Carolina, I was walking with Adam O'Neill, the white Republican mayor of Belhaven, North Carolina. We were walking from Belhaven to Washington, D.C. to try to save the little hospital in Belhaven. And one day, Adam said to me, we had endless discussions about politics as we were walking. And a lot of the time it was just two of us. So we were walking, and it does take more energy and more effort to talk while you're walking 20 something miles a day. But Adam said to me at one point, he said, "Bob, you are such a liberal." And I said, "Oh, no, I'm not a liberal." He said, "Well, what would you call yourself?" And I said, "I'm a radical." And he said, "Well, what's the difference?" And I said, "What radical means is that you go to the root of the problem. Radical means root." And I quoted some great philosopher, and I can't remember right now who it was. Might have been Henry David Thoreau, who said, "For every moderate and liberal who is hacking at the leaves and branches of evil, there's one radical hacking at its root." So I said, I think, Adam, what you and I share is that we're both radicals. We're trying to go to the root of what would cause a huge corporation to close a hospital that is desperately needed. And we're both trying to go to the root of that problem, which is corporate greed. And so we're radicals, not liberals or moderates. And that's what Dr. King was talking about in his letter from the Birmingham jail. He said, we're not so much worried about the racists and the haters. What we're worried about is the good people, the moderates, the liberals, the people that say, you need to take it slow. You're just making people feel bad, and you're setting your cause back. So he had to explain what was the difference. And my father, who left the Ku Klux Klan and started working with Dr. King and Joe Lowry here in Alabama, Daddy used to say, a liberal is worth no more than a bucket of warm spit. I mean, he had no use. He said they're pollywogs. They don't know if they're frogs or fish, and they have no principles and nothing they'll stand up for. So we very proudly endorse a label for ourselves as radical.
Well, 60 years later, you're still walking the walk, Bob. So you definitely earned that title.
Well, I can't walk 20 miles a day anymore. It's why maybe since I was doing all that exercise, it allowed me to get 81 years old and still, at least I can talk anyway.
Yes. All right, Emma, I have a follow-up question for you from one of the attendees who wanted to know, what did you say to the person who said racism is not a problem?
I shared with them an experience I had where I know it was race in the way that I was treated. There was no other reason. And I'll give you a quickie. At the time, when everybody had to have no hands free with the phone and all that kind of stuff. So I ran inside AT&T. I had already bought one, but it wasn't working. The young man behind the counter told me it wasn't working, but he would not exchange it, no matter what I said. But I know even before that, before I was the next person at the counter, a gentleman allowed me to go to the counter next because he left the line. The gentleman behind the counter called across the room and tried to wait on that guy. And he said, no, wait on her. To make the long and short of it is, there was no reason for that young man to not just take care of exchange. I had the receipt, I had everything. So racism is still alive because it's a lot in treatment. And that's not the only thing I've experienced where I know it was my race. But I gave that person some food for thought and told them to think about some of the things that you might say or do. Is it based on your own bias? Because we all have them, but race is still, and racism is still alive and well. And a lot of people do and decide things based just on that. But that's it in a nutshell.
I'm so sorry you had to go through that.
No, that's okay.
Especially in this
Listen,
day and age.
you know what? But it's still, it doesn't change me from being proud to be who I am. You know, I'm this person, this is the way I am. My parents helped me to love myself. That way you can love other people. So it's all good. You know, but it's within ourselves that we have to make a point to, no matter what, you don't let that change you from caring about your fellow man. That's it. That's how we have to be. And so thusly, there are still organizations and people out here that are still willing to march and fight and make a point for change and democracy. So.
All right, I'm looking at the time. Bob, do you have time for one more question? Because I know you got something important.
Oh, yes. I do have time for another question.
Okay.
But I guess what we're talking about is I'll tell you later about what else is happening this evening.
Tell us now.
Go ahead.
While we're doing this, the first showing of the movie from my memoir, The Wrong Side of Murder Creek, is occurring tonight at the American Black Film Festival in Miami, Florida, and it's going to be streamed for all of the people that are registered for that film festival.
Congratulations.
It's fantastic. I'm so excited for you. So we have a question from an attendee asking, can you compare the Moral Monday movement with the 1960s? What's different now?
Well, the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina was similar to the 60s in some ways and different in others. One way that it was similar was that it took some people who were very dedicated to addressing what was happening in North Carolina, a radical change in the government, where the extremists took over the House, the Senate, and the governorship all at one time. And they immediately set about doing the things that they had dreamed about doing. And so Reverend Barber and Derek Smith and all of the people who rallied to that cause, it was very similar to what happened in the 60s, because there was such a pent-up demand for some kind of organizational response to this outrage. The same thing happened in SNCC when the 4 freshmen sat down once again in North Carolina, Greensboro, North Carolina, February the 1st. And it just was a crack in the dam that just broke the dam and flooded, so that hundreds and thousands of people across the South were mobilized as if overnight. And it also sparked a response among young people and people of goodwill all across the nation. It was a huge leap forward. So it was similar in that way. One of the ways that the fusion movement or the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina was different, from the very beginning, Reverend Barber and the leaders of the Moral Mondays movement saw the importance of and set about the taking steps to reach across racial lines and all kinds of class and nationality, sexuality, to reach across all these lines. And in the 60s movement, there was, and it's understandable because the main problem was voter registration, and the main problem was the black and white situation. There was not immediately the attempt to reach across racial lines and all those division lines. And it took about 6 or 7 years of work in the civil rights movement before there was a demand in the civil rights movement to begin to reach out to and work with poor and working class white people in the South. So it took a little while for that to happen in the 60s, but it started right away in the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina.
And can you read the second half of that question, Kristine?
Yes. The second half of the question, oops, everything moved, is voter ID racist even if supporters deny it?
So so you brought up Bob Moses talking about the arraignment of the sheriffs and how in Life magazine when they were laughing, and he said that gave white people cover, right? That was that's not us. We're not racist. Those are racists, right? And how unless we come together as a people and understand that we are all responsible for this, that we're never going to be able to move forward, right? Mm-hmm. I often mark that as maybe the most important line in my film if I have to rank lines in my film. The second most important line in my film, if I have to rank lines in my film, was in regard to that question. Is voter ID racist even if the supporters deny it? Well, Reverend Barber points out this very clearly. And he says, you know, if these people are passing laws and we tell you that it's racist, that it's racialized, that it's harmful to people of color and poor people, and you keep doing it, then yeah, it's racist, right? Because you're not only an extremist, you're an extremist without excuse, because it's not that you don't know any better now, right? We've pointed this out to you that you're harming us, and you say, oh, we're not harming you, and then you keep doing it. Right. So it's hard to actually see it any other way. And one of the things that I found making the film that was really fascinating was having these kind of discussions with people from Bob's generation, right? Oh, these people say it's not racist. And Julian Bowen said, of course it's racist, right? I'd say to Dick Gregory, he'd say, what are you, crazy? Like they can't see it any other way because they've marched more than a mile in their own shoes. And they've had experiences like Emma has just described, but, you know, like that and on steroids because they were confrontational and they would get beaten up and thrown in jail. And they know exactly what it's about. And Dick Gregory, who's no longer with us, he has a comedian's way with words, right? And so he said to me, do you know how I knew that the FBI was tapping my phone? And he was paranoid about this well into his 80s, right? Because of these experiences. And I said, well, how did you know that the FBI was tapping your phone? He said, I stopped paying my bill and I still had a dial tone. Right? He said, what black man doesn't pay his phone bill and has service? He said, they want to know what I'm saying. So they kept my phone on. So, you know, when you have those life experiences under your belt, you're going to have a really tough time convincing people that your motives are pure when they have experience that says they're not, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's not my place to say, right, as a white guy, whether or not Emma's experience is right or not, right? She knows that. It's not, I don't have standing in that argument. So whether or not you say, whether or not you believe that voter fraud's a problem and we need voter ID, if people of color and poor people are telling you that this is harmful, you should step back and think about it from that point of view, you know, and that's not happening enough.
Yeah, no, to me, it kind of goes back to as today is Women Equality Day, it was the signing of the 19th Amendment into the Constitution. One of the mottos was deeds, not words. And when your deed is in fact having some sort of impact, is racist in action, it doesn't really matter what your words are. Because if you continue to act in that manner, then you're just proving the point. And one of the, I guess, so-called easy ways to do this is to actually gerrymander, to draw the district lines, say that it's partisan, because our Supreme Court's already stepped back and said we're not going to make any decisions on partisan gerrymandering. They will still for racial. So there's this kind of dividing line. So Emma, I actually wanted to talk to you about why it's so important to vote this year, because what else is going on?
Yeah.
Well, as everyone knows, I'll say a lot of people know, the census is going on as well. And for everyone that has not made a point to sit down and do those questions, please do so, because it does make a difference in federal dollars and things like that. But for local folks, your legislature, it's not only dollars, but it's also the number of seats that they get in the House of Representatives. I think that's the biggie, the number of seats. And so, but also, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Not only that, who's actually drawing those lines?
Oh,
The districts.
the districts.
Are drawn by the state legislatures.
By the state legislature, yes.
And are we voting for the state legislature in Connecticut this year?
Oh, well, yes. Well, I'm
Yeah.
saying no, but yes, and
Yeah.
presidential. And that's even bigger in terms of what it really means, underlying causes. So yeah,
Yeah.
really, really important.
Yeah. So the point we're trying to make is that down ballot elections have a
Okay,
really
there it is. That's the word.
effect on your life. It's not
Mm.
just your senator, it's not just your president,
Right.
your selectmen, your councilmen, your state reps. These people affect your everyday life. They're
Everyday
the Board
life.
of Ed,
Yep, taxes.
all these people, judges. These are people who have a direct impact on your day-to-day living, and not least of which, they get to draw your state. Most states, they get to draw the district maps, and then when they draw the district maps, that tells you how many representatives you send to Congress, and pretty much they can guarantee which party is gonna be represented, right? So in effect, the representatives, the politicians, are picking their voters instead of the voters picking their politicians, which is the exact opposite of the way it's meant to happen. And I edited gerrymandering out of the film because it's sort of its own movie, and my film was already too long. But boy, there's a lot to talk about. And North Carolina is right there again. I mean, kind of, it's like that's their thing.
It even happens here in Connecticut when they redrew the lines after the 2010 census.
Correct.
I believe it was the Connecticut Mirror that actually did the study, and I forget the number, but there was a number of districts that were guaranteed to be Democrat, and there were a number that were guaranteed to be Republican. And it was actually, I believe, less than half were competitive districts. And the two parties colluded with one another over that. So kind of going back to that earlier quote of, it's not just Mississippi, it's not just North Carolina, it's also Connecticut, it's the entire country. We all have to be looking at that.
And everybody likes a safe seat, right? So yes, they will collude with each other because the Democratic incumbent wants to keep his seat as much as the Republican incumbent does, right? So there was a lot of collusion across party lines to draw districts, right? Julian Bond was talking about that, about blackening a district, making it even more black, right? So that guy who had 85% of the vote would get 90% of the vote.
Yeah.
It's a real problem.
right, so I have a question from one of our attendees. As a relatively new citizen to this country, do I understand correctly from what you just said, census response crucial to effects on electoral college? The answer is yes, because the number of electoral college votes each state gets is simple math. It's how many representatives you have in the House of Representatives plus your 2 senators. So if states lose population, they will lose members of the House of Representatives. And we figure out population from the census. So if not enough people actually fill out the census and we get undercounted, we may actually lose a seat in the House of Representatives. And therefore, we would have less impact in the Electoral College.
Yes.
So very important for everyone to fill out the census. And I'm going to repeat for everyone, the census is anonymous. They are doing it based off of your address. There is no way for them to track you. They are forbidden by federal law from sharing that information that is personally identifiable to you. So it cannot be shared with people like the Department of Justice, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. You do not need to be a citizen. In fact, our Constitution requires the counting of all persons. It never says anything about this, about citizenship, doesn't even say anything about whether you're here legally or not. It's important for everyone to fill it out. So there was a follow-up question. The Electoral College is how we determine who is the president. So when you go in and vote in November, you're actually not voting for Joe Biden, Donald Trump, whoever the Libertarian is, and if anyone else is running. You're actually voting for electors to elect Joe Biden, electors to vote Donald Trump. And the real election happens on December 15th when all the electors gather in their state legislative houses and cast their ballots. So I hope that was helpful for you. I have one more question that I want to ask to everyone. And then if there are any more questions from the audience, please keep them coming in. So the final question I had is John Lewis, who unfortunately we lost just a couple weeks ago, said in 2020, when you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to speak up. You have to say something. You have to do something. So what do you believe we need to do today to continue this good work?
I'll go first. So, I think that part of the moral of the film, right, the joke of the film, if you will, is that people say to me, and it's been said tonight, how timely this film is, right? The sad part is 20 years from now, it's likely to be just as timely, right? That this is an evergreen project. It's just voter suppression is what we do, okay? And I kind of said more than once prior to this year that none of this stuff is new, although I will say that the scuttling of the post office took me by surprise. That was sort of a new tactic that I didn't see coming, but for the most part, voter suppression is a normal thing. What I'd like people to do is educate themselves, and hopefully my film helps with that. Some things that people don't always know, and is that every state has their own election laws. Okay, we do not have a federal election system. We have 50 different election systems. And oftentimes, the Secretary of State who is in charge of the election is a fierce partisan. They can be the campaign manager of one of the candidates. And it's in their interest to pick the voters, right? So they close polling stations in black districts, or they, voting machines go missing, or all this kind of stuff happens. And what we've learned, even just in this post office fiasco, is that pressure works, right? If you shine a light on something and you make enough noise, people pay attention because they think no one's paying attention. So if you can, be out there on the streets, if you can wave signs in front of cameras, you can do whatever you do to let them know that you're watching them and that you're onto them. It may not seem like a lot, but cumulatively, in enough states, like this Black Lives Matter thing happening in all 50 states and around the world, it puts pressure on people to react. They can't pretend it's not happening, right? So I would say to you is to learn, you know, who's in charge of your election, who's in charge of where your voting stations are, make sure that there's adequate coverage for people who are going to vote. And that's the high end of the bar. The low end is to make sure you register and vote, and maybe make sure your family and friends are registered to vote. So that's my piece there.
Mhm.
Who's next?
You referenced John Lewis in that question, and I think one of the things that John Lewis would point out right now, as he worked right up till the time he was within a week or so of his death, I think he would point out that we have that voter ID is racist for sure, and it's a new form of racism, because in the 60s, it was somewhat easier for us because we had actual people who were known and famous racists. We had George Wallace, we had Bull Connor, we had Byron D. LeBeckwith, and now we have racism without racists. So that's why voter ID is a systemic racism. So it's racism without racists. So you can't point to somebody and say, that is so obviously racist. It's the racism of the system. So racism is a cunning virus, almost as cunning as this coronavirus. The virus has a responsibility to try to get around all of the defenses that we have against it. So racism is the same way. And now we have incredible racism nationally. That's a systemic racism, a racism without racists. So we have a little bit of harder job to do because they are cunning and they take on camouflage.
Ditto. But I think for me, I think about John Lewis. I think about this quote and some of his other quotes, but I think he would ask you to examine yourself and say, what part can I do? And in my own way, my involvement, not only with the NAACP, but my involvement is something that I know I can do to make a difference in my community. And so this film and other things that I know because of my upbringing energizes me to stay involved, keep sharing the importance and the power of the vote. And I'm hopeful that it energizes people to get up and just go ahead and vote. And so that people like John Lewis, Julian Bond, Ella Baker, all those soldiers that we all stand on their shoulders. So how can we do anything less than be involved? And so you can do something, you can say something, and saying is marching. When you have a poster, or whether you're on the phone calling and encouraging people to vote, that's what you can do. And I think that he would be pleased as punch right now. And I'm sure he saw this whole insurgents across the country and in other countries, that so many people heeded the call. And so I think that even in his passing, he passed knowing that it was left in good hands and that people will continue. So that's just my take on it.
Well, we just got a question from one of our attendees that actually does bring in international. So the attendee said, many of us coming from dictatorships or war have a lot to say, but many among us will not speak up, especially with dangers of not being, I'm going to paraphrase here, not being able to really be anonymous, the craziness of internet, social media. How do you encourage people to speak up even when they fear lives of their loved ones? And I'm going to add on to that. Or in case of laws. Tennessee just passed a new law that said if you get arrested as a protester, it's now a Class D felony that can take away your right to vote.
Oh, my
Gracious.
word.
Yes. So
That's deep.
so there are a lot of states where if you are found guilty of a felony, you lose your right to vote, sometimes for life. So there are a whole lot of other voter suppression that we could hold another session on. But how do you encourage people to speak up even when they're in fear?
That's a Bob Zellner question, because I've never been in fear like that, you know. So
I guess it goes back to the idea of acting in spite of your fear.
exactly.
So how do you encourage people, Bob?
Well, I think that what Bob Moses went through in Mississippi, that's pointed out so well in this film, is that when you influence people to take a certain course of action, you're actually putting them in danger and their families. And Bob Moses had to decide that this is a struggle that means that we'll have to put ourselves in danger. We'll have to put people that we're working with in danger, and that puts their families in danger. And because of that, are we supposed not to take these steps? Are we supposed not to do these things? And it's one of the strongest weapons, I think, that the dictators and the haters use, is that, well, you are putting your life on the line, but how about endangering your child's life, or your mother, or your father, or your family member? So these are all things that the enemy does, and people throughout history have said, I have to go forward. And the thing that hurts me the most sometimes is to think about the hurt that my daughters, Margaret and Katie, had to go through when Dottie and I were so involved. And they were sometimes endangered by what we were doing, but we had to go ahead and do that anyway. So everybody has to make their own decision, and sometimes it's just too hard for people to put their loved ones in danger. It's easier to put yourself in danger than someone you love.
Before we wrap up, I know we're wrapping up now. I just want to one more thing is I am going to leave the film live on that link that you all have for to the end of Saturday. Also, if anybody in the audience has any sort of community groups they want to have a screening panel discussion with, contact me or someone, you know, directly, and I'm happy to set that up. You know, my goal is to get this out to as many people as possible before the election, right? Because we're trying to move the ball forward here. And so thank you all for coming, just from me personally.
All right. Now, as I promised, I'm going to answer the questions about the absentee ballot really quickly.
Okay, good.
All right. So the Secretary of the State is going to be mailing out between September 8th and September 11th the applications for the absentee ballot. In Stamford, and I know in New Canaan, and I'm pretty sure in every other town, they would prefer for you to wait and get that application because it's barcoded.
Right.
Don't download an application and send it in unless you happen to be a college student leaving for college and won't be here to get the application. But that one that gets mailed to you, literally the day you get it,
Right.
fill out the application, put it back in the envelope, and put it back in the mailbox.
Right.
The other thing you can do, if you don't want to depend on the U.S. Postal Service, all of the ballot drop boxes are going to be unlocked, and you can actually drop your application in the ballot drop box, and they will be checking them regularly, getting out all the applications. Now, once the application gets in, the town clerk is going to mail you your absentee ballot starting October 2nd. They cannot do it any earlier because it has to be 31 days before the election. So starting October 2nd, they can start mailing out those ballots. And it is going to come from the town clerk's office. It's not going to come from that mailing place. I know that there were problems with people receiving the wrong ballot. They are going to be mailing the ballots out October 2nd. Again, as soon as you get that absentee ballot, my recommendation personally is that you fill it out and you return it no later than October 15th if you're going to be mailing it through the Postal Service. I know they said by October 27th. I'm telling you October 15th. You can take all the way up until 8 p.m. on Election Day to drop it in a drop box. The League of Women Voters is going to be putting out our Voters Guide early this year because we know more people are going to be using the absentee ballot. So look for us on lwvstanford.org or our Voters Guide page, stanfordelections.com. We will have all the local elections with all the answers to the questions that we're putting. So we will have that. If you have any other questions,